Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the sixth episode, our sixth stream here of Julius Caesar and the Gallic War, our coverage of the writings of Divus Julius. If you're watching this on YouTube, thank you so much for listening to this talk and this reading of the Gallic Wars. I hope you've been enjoying it so far. You can follow me on Twitch at twitch.tv/authorvalentine. We do these readings live on Wednesday nights. Well, Wednesday nights in Japan, starting at 6 p.m. Japan time. For those of you here on Twitch live with me, thank you also. I very much appreciate you guys being here so that you can sit around our little Gallic campfire and hear the words of the god, Julius Caesar. We're about halfway through the Gallic War. Halfway, can you believe it? We've just entered into the year 54 BC. And we've been here since 58 BC. In terms of raw time, I guess you could say we're a little more than halfway through, but in terms of events, a little less. On the book, we're on page 89, the fifth book. And just to reiterate, a little bit of what happened in the previous chapter, because there was so much. It was a shorter chapter, but it was really packed full of things that were going on kind of all at the same time. The first thing that happened in 55 was a second Germanic invasion. This was the invasion of the Euseppides and the Tencteri, two tribes who banded together and they crossed over into northern Gaul. They crossed the Rhine, and they invaded the territory of a tribe called the Menapi. And soon they were flooding across the Rhine, as Germans are wont to do. Now, Caesar was able to push back this invasion and completely destroy the invaders. After which, Caesar, deciding that the Germans were incited too frequently to cross the Rhine in an aggressive manner, Caesar himself decided to be the first Roman to lead an army across the Rhine and make an attack into Germanic territory itself, which was incredible because this had never happened before. No Roman, at least no Roman general, had ever crossed the Rhine River. He only stayed in Germany for 18 days, less than a month. He built an incredible bridge over the Rhine, and then upon his return to Gaul, he destroyed the bridge. And for the last part of the year, he decided to cross the English Channel and enter into Britannia. Now, this first foray into Britain was not a great success. There wasn't any significant military defeat or victory. Rather, most of his forces, all of his cavalry, were stranded in Gaul. Bad weather forced them to turn back. And many of his ships were damaged in a storm, so he had to leave Britannia in a bit of a hurry, in a bit of a precarious situation. So Caesar returned to Gaul, and after this return there was the famous event where two of his ships get blown off course and 300 men get stranded in the territory of the Nervi, so in Belgae territory. And the Belgae bring 6,000 men to surround these 300, and they order them to drop their weapons, but the Romans refuse. And so Caesar, upon hearing that these two ships have gone off course and they're stuck in Belgae territory, he leads everyone he can muster to the rescue of his wayward Roman troops. And he's able to save every single one of them. And this is yet another major event that makes Caesar completely beloved by his men. because he will risk everything in order to ensure the survival, the health, and the wealth of his men. It's not just about him. It's about the legions, it's about his commanders, his legates, and it's about Rome. And that leads us into Book 54. And Book 54 is, wow, it's full of everything, really. It's expansion, it's betrayal, it's death and defeat, it's humanity pushed to the edge and rising to the challenge and conquering incalculable odds. The year by the Roman calendar is 700 AUC. The consuls are Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus and Appius Claudius Pulcher. The title of the chapter is The Second British Expedition, The Deaths of Cotta and Sabinus, Quintus Cicero against Ambiorix, Labienus against the Treveri. And so just like our last reading, there is a lot to cover in this chapter, and it is a bit longer than last chapter as well. So let's get started. Caesar says, during the consulship of Lucius Domitius and Appius Claudius, Caesar left his winter quarters for Italy, as he was accustomed to do every year. He ordered the legates whom he had left in charge of the legions to have as many ships as possible built that winter, and the old ones refitted. He specified the form and style of these ships. For speed of loading and beaching, he made them a little lower than the vessels we habitually use in the Mediterranean. This was all the more appropriate because he had discovered that the waves were smaller, because of the frequency of the tidal changes. For cargo and carrying large numbers of pack animals, he made them slightly broader than the sort we use on other seas. For maximum speed, he ordered them all to be constructed with both oars and sails. Their low profile helped this aim considerably. He gave instructions for the tackle for arming the ships to be imported from Spain. Once the assizes in Nearer Gaul were ended, he himself set out for Illyricum, because he was receiving reports that the region nearest to the province was being ravaged by raids of the Pirustae. On his arrival, he levied troops from the peoples there and told them to muster at a particular place. When news of his action came, the Pirustae sent envoys to prove that none of these events had happened as a matter of public policy. They showed themselves ready to make reparation by all possible means for any damage done. Caesar heard their speech, then demanded hostages and ordered them to be produced on a given day. If they failed in this, he made it clear he would pursue a campaign against their nation. The hostages were brought on the appropriate day, as he had demanded, and he appointed arbitrators between the peoples to assess the damages and settle penalties. These affairs thus settled, and his assizes at an end, he returned to Nearer Gaul, and from there set out for his army. When he reached it, he made the rounds of all the winter quarters, and discovered that thanks to the soldiers' remarkable zeal, and despite a severe shortage of materials, about 600 ships of the kind we described above had been constructed, together with 28 warships. They were almost ready for launching within a few days. He commended the men and the officers in charge of the business, then set out what he wanted to happen, and ordered everyone to assemble at Portus Itius. He had discovered that the crossing to Britain was easiest from there, a voyage of only about 27 miles from mainland Gaul. Leaving behind what seemed an adequate number of soldiers for the purpose, he took 4 legions without heavy kit and 800 cavalry, and set out for the territory of the Treveri, who were persistently failing to attend assemblies and obey his commands, and were rumored to be seeking the support of the Germans living across the Rhine. In cavalry, the Treveri are by far the strongest nation in the whole of Gaul. They also have large infantry forces, and as we mentioned earlier, border the Rhine. Within their nation, two men called Indutiomarus and Cingetorix were competing for supreme power. As soon as the arrival of Caesar and his legions became known, one of the two, Cingetorix, approached Caesar and promised that he and all his people would be loyal and not abandon the friendship of the Roman people, and he revealed what was going on among the Treveri. Indutiomarus, however, began to make ready for war, mustering cavalry and infantry, and hiding those who were not of an age to bear arms in the Ardennes forest. This forest is extremely large, and reaches from the Rhine through the middle of the Treveri's lands to the borders of the Remi. Some of the leaders of the Treveri were encouraged by their kinship with Cingetorix, and frightened by the presence of our army, so they approached Caesar. They began to consult him in private about their own affairs, since they could not take measures to protect their nation. Then Indutiomarus was afraid of being abandoned by everyone, and sent envoys to Caesar. He claimed that he had been reluctant to leave his own people and approach Caesar, because by staying he would more easily keep the nation loyal, and the ordinary people would not fall into ignorant error with all the aristocracy gone away. In consequence of this whole nation was under his control, and if Caesar would permit it, he would come to his camp and entrust his own fortunes and those of the nation to Caesar's good faith. Caesar was well aware of the reason for Indutiomarus's words, and of what was deterring him from the policy with which he had begun. Even so, to avoid being forced to waste the campaigning season among the Treveri when everything was ready for the war in Britain, he ordered Indutiomarus to come to him with 200 hostages. Once these were produced, among them his son and all his relations whom Caesar had summoned by name, he comforted Indutiomarus and urged him to remain loyal. All the same, he summoned the leaders of the Treveri and one at a time won them over to Cingetorix. He did this because he realized that Cingetorix, whose goodwill towards Caesar himself was evident, deserved this favor, but also because he considered it a matter of importance for Cingetorix's authority among his own people to be as great as possible. Indutiomarus took this restriction of his own influence among his people badly. Previously, he had been hostile in his intentions towards us, but now he was even more fiercely ablaze with indignation. These matters settled, Caesar reached Portus Itius with his legions. There he learned that 60 ships built by the Meldi had been unable to hold their course, but were forced back by bad weather. They had returned to the same place from which they had set sail. All the rest he found ready to sail and fully equipped. At the same place, cavalry from all over Gaul assembled, about 4,000 in number, and the leaders of all the states. He had decided to leave a few of them, those whose loyalty was evident, in Gaul. The rest he took with him in place of hostages, because he feared that Gaul would revolt during his absence. Among this majority was Dumnorix the Aeduan, whom we have mentioned before. Caesar was particularly anxious to keep this man at his side, because he knew him to be eager for revolution and eager for power, audacious and influential among the Gauls. There was also the fact that at an assembly of the Aedui, Dumnorix had claimed that Caesar was offering him dominion over their nation. It was a claim the Aedui took badly, but they did not dare to send envoys to Caesar to reject or criticize him for it. Caesar had learned of this from his own supporters. At first, Dumnorix pleaded all kinds of reasons why he should be left behind in Gaul. For one thing, he claimed, he knew nothing of sailing and was afraid of the sea. For another, or so he alleged, religious obligations prevented him from going. Once he saw that his request was obdurately refused, and all hope of getting what he wanted was snatched away, he began to stir up the Gallic leaders, to draw them aside individually, and urge them to stay behind on the Gallic mainland. He tried to frighten them. Not without reason, he asserted, was Gaul being stripped of all her aristocracy. Caesar was afraid to kill them in sight of Gaul, but planned instead to take them all to Britain and there put them to death. He pledged his word to the rest, and demanded an oath that they should carry out whatever they saw was to Gaul's advantage. A number of informers reported this to Caesar. Caesar had a high opinion of the status and position of the Aedui, so on hearing this he decided that Dumnorix must be checked and deterred by every means possible. He saw Dumnorix's madness spreading abroad, and so it was his duty to watch out that neither he nor the Republic suffered harm. So when he was detained in the area for about 25 days, because the northwest wind, which is the prevailing wind in the vicinity, prevented his sailing, he took steps to keep Dumnorix to his allegiance, but just the same he gathered information about all his plans. At last, Caesar had good sailing weather, and ordered his soldiers and cavalry to embark. But while everyone's minds were preoccupied, Dumnorix and the Aeduan cavalry began to leave camp and go home, without Caesar's knowledge. When he did learn of it, Caesar stopped the expedition and, postponing everything else, sent a large section of the cavalry to pursue Dumnorix and gave orders for him to be dragged back. If he offered armed resistance and would not obey, he told them to kill him, for he judged that a man who had disregarded Caesar's command when Caesar was actually present would certainly not behave like a sensible man in Caesar's absence. As might be expected, when he was summoned to return, Dumnorix began his resistance, defending himself by force and appealing to his supporters' loyalty. He continually cried that he was a free man and a citizen of a free state. Caesar's men surrounded and killed him as ordered. All the Aeduan cavalry, however, returned to Caesar. After these events, Labienus was left on the mainland with 3 legions and about 2,000 cavalry to watch over the harbors, see to the corn supply, and find out what was happening in Gaul, and make his plans according to circumstances and events. Caesar set out with 5 legions, and the same number of cavalry as he had left on the mainland. He weighed anchor at sunset. A gentle southwesterly breeze carried him out, but around midnight it dropped and he could no longer maintain its course. He was then carried too far by the flood tide, and at dawn saw Britain being left behind to port. Then he followed the ebb tide back and rowed hard to reach that place of the island where he had found the best landing places the previous summer. In this the courage of the soldiers was most commendable, for even in the heavily laden transport vessels they managed, by undertaking to row, without a break, to keep pace with the course of the warships. The whole fleet reached Britain at around midday, but there was no enemy visible in the area. Later, however, Caesar learned from prisoners that although a large host of them had arrived, they had panicked at the size of the fleet, which, including last year's ships and the private vessels which certain individuals had built for their convenience, was seen to number more than 800 at once. So they had left the shore and hidden themselves away on higher ground. The army landed and a suitable site for camp was found. When Caesar learned from the prisoners where the enemy forces were stationed, he left 10 cohorts and 300 cavalry on the shore to guard the fleet, and during the 3rd watch set out against the enemy. He was the less concerned for the fleet because he was leaving it anchored along a sandy, low-lying coast. He put Quintus Atrius in charge of the garrison. During the night, he advanced about 11 miles before catching sight of the enemy forces. They brought their cavalry and chariots forward from higher ground to a river, and began to block the way of our men and engage in fighting. They were forced back by our cavalry and hid in the forest, where they occupied a place which was strong in both natural and man-made defenses. It was apparent that they had previously made this ready to serve in their domestic warfare, for every one of the entrances was blocked off by the felling of a large number of trees. They came out from the forest to fight in small detachments, and prevented our men from coming within the fortifications. But the men of the 7th Legion formed up into a tortoise, piled up a ramp against the fortifications, seized control of the stronghold, and drove the enemy from the forest. They themselves suffered few casualties. Caesar, however, forbade them to pursue the fugitives very far, both because he was not familiar with the terrain and because the day was already far spent, and he wanted there to be enough time left for fortifying a camp. And so we have come back to Britain. And before we talk too much about Britain here, just as an aside, I want to talk a little bit about what happened with Dumnorix. And that might be a familiar name because that name is a one we heard at the very beginning of the accounts of the Gallic War. Dumnorix is the brother of Divicasius, who was the chief magistrate, the leader of the Aedui, when Caesar had become proconsul of Gaul, of Cisalpine, Transalpine, and Gaul and Illyricum. It was Divicasius who was asking Caesar for help. He was joined by Divicasius against the Helvetii, and again against Ariovistus. And if we go all the way back to the conflict against the Helvetii, Caesar was relying on the Aedui heavily for supplies of corn, right? So his food supply was provided by the Aedui, but Dumnorix, who was, again, a powerful Aeduan, he was an aristocrat, was sabotaging this effort and preventing supplies from reaching Caesar. And Caesar intended to kill Dumnorix, but Divicasius begged him, he pleaded. He's like, listen, I know he did wrong, but Dumnorix is my brother. And if you show him mercy, it will be better for our relations than if you kill him, because it's not just the fact that he's my brother, he's also a very influential Gaul, and if you kill him, essentially just make a martyr out of him. So Caesar calms down, he says, okay, we'll keep him under guard, but he can have his freedom as long as he doesn't get in the way of the campaign any further. And I think that was really the last we heard of Dumnorix. It was all the way back in the year 58 BC, maybe 57. His name came up. And here he is again. He's still involved, of course, in Gallic politics, except this time he violently protests to being taken along to Britain with Caesar. So Caesar says that he's taking all the Gallic leaders with him in place of hostages, right? So remember, Caesar's cavalry is mostly Gallic cavalry. It's Gallic auxiliaries who are supporting his troops. And normally, in order to ensure the cooperation of a tribe who he had done war with and surrendered to him, he would, get hostages. He would bring those hostages around. But because he's going on campaign in Britain, he thought, you know what? I'll leave the Gallic leadership who's shown loyalty, so like the Remi, the Aedui, some of the other southern tribes, that their leaders can stay, but the Treveri, the Dumnorix of the Aedui, or maybe some of the other ones, the local ones, but probably more of the Belgae, I'm going to have their leadership come with us just so that they can't be stuck back in Gaul causing you-know-what while I'm in Britain. Because that's his fear. His fear is he'll be in Britain on a campaign, and he'll come back, and Gaul will be on fire, and he'll have several defeated legions, and he'll be fighting a war trying to get back into Italy. So that was his reasoning. Dumnorix didn't see it this way. Dumnorix is like, no, this is a ploy. He's taking us to Britain to kill us out of sight of our own people, so if we die, he can just go talk to our people and say, oh, they died in battle heroically, but actually he's going to kill us. He was completely paranoid about this. So Dumnorix takes his forces, he takes his Aeduan cavalry, and he leaves. Of course, Caesar chases after him, and I think this is interesting because he's with his cavalry, but when Caesar's cavalry catches up with him and says, hey, you got to come back, he says no, he starts fighting, and instead of all of his Aeduan cavalry supporting him, it sounds like they go back. They're like, we'll go back with Caesar, and we'll do this, and Dumnorix gets killed. And that's the end of Dumnorix. So, an interesting end to Dumnorix the Aeduan. We will not be hearing from him again. But will his prediction be true? Was he an actual martyr? What will happen? We'll have to see. So now Caesar is in Britannia once again. For the second time, we have crossed the English Channel. So let's go ahead and read some more. The following morning, he sent the soldiers and cavalry out in 3 divisions on a foray to pursue fugitives. After they had marched a considerable distance, they caught sight of the enemy rear guard. Just then, riders came to Caesar from Quintus Atrius and reported that a terrible storm had blown up the night before, and almost all the ships were damaged and cast up on the shore, for the anchors and ropes had failed. And so the sailors and helmsmen could not withstand the force of the storm. As a result, the ships had been dashed one against another, and serious damage had resulted. On learning this, Caesar ordered the legions and cavalry to be recalled and to maintain their resistance on the march. He himself returned to the ships. Then he saw everything for himself, almost exactly as he had heard it described by the messengers in dispatch. Yet although about 40 ships were lost, it was apparent that with considerable labor the rest could be rebuilt. So he selected workmen from the legions and ordered more to be summoned from mainland Gaul. He wrote to Labienus to have as many ships as possible built by those legions presently under his command. Then, despite the considerable difficulty and effort involved, Caesar decided the most convenient solution was to beach all the ships and join them with the camp by a single line of fortification. The work lasted for 10 days. The soldiers had no break from their efforts, even at night. Once the ships were beached and the camp strongly fortified, he left the same forces as before to guard the fleet, and returned to the place he had left earlier. By the time of his arrival, even larger British forces had mustered there. By common agreement, they had entrusted the supreme command of their campaign to Cassivellaunus, whose lands were separated from the coastal states by a river called the Thames, which is about 73 miles from the sea. Between Cassivellaunus and the other states there had previously been continual warfare, but our arrival frightened the Britons into putting him in charge of the entire war effort. The inland regions of Britain are inhabited by people whom the Britons themselves claim, according to oral tradition, are indigenous. The coastal areas belong to people who once crossed from Belgium in search of booty and war. Almost all of these inhabitants are called by the same national names as those of the states they originally came from. After waging war, they remained in Britain and began to farm the land. Population density is high, and their dwellings are extremely numerous and very like those of the Gauls. They have large herds of cattle. They use either bronze or gold coinage, or, instead of currency, iron rods of a fixed weight. Tin is found in the Midland regions, iron along the coast, but only in small quantities. Their bronze is imported. Timber of all kinds is found as in Gaul, except for beech and silver fir. They consider it wrong to eat hare, chicken, or goose, but still they look after them for pleasure and amusement. The climate is more temperate than in Gaul, and the winters milder. The island is triangular in shape. One side faces Gaul, and one corner of this side, in Kent, is where almost all ships from Gaul put into harbor. This corner looks east, the other south. The side stretches for about 460 miles. The second side looks towards Spain and the west. In this direction lies Ireland, which is thought to be half the size of Britain. The crossing from Britain to Ireland is the same as that from Gaul to Britain. Midway lies an island called Mona. There are thought to be several smaller islands besides lying nearby, and several writers have recorded that over the winter solstice there is continual darkness there for 30 days. We were unable to find out the truth of these inquiries, except that by accurate measurements with a water clock we observed that the nights were shorter than in mainland Gaul. According to the belief of the Britons, this side is some 640 miles long. The third side looks north and faces no other land, but it is mainly angled towards Germany. It is thought to be about 730 miles long. Thus, the whole island is nearly 2,000 miles in circumference. Of all the island's inhabitants, by far the most civilized are those who live in Kent, a region which is entirely coastal. Their way of life is much the same as that of the Gauls. Inland, the people for the most part do not plant corn crops, but live on milk and meat, and clothe themselves in animal skins. All the Britons paint themselves with woad, which produces a dark blue color. By this means they appear more frightening in battle. They have long hair and shave their bodies, all except for the head and upper lip. Groups of 10 or 12 men share their wives in common, particularly between brothers or father and son. Any offspring they have are held to be children of him whom the maiden was brought first. The enemy cavalry and charioteers clashed fiercely in combat with our cavalry on the march, though the outcome showed that our men were superior in every respect and drove them into the woods and hills. Despite killing a number of the enemy, they pursued too eagerly and lost a number of their own side. After a short time, when our men were off guard and busy fortifying the camp, the Britons suddenly rushed out of the woods and attacked the guard station in front of the camp. A fierce fight ensued. Caesar sent 2 cohorts to their assistance, the primary cohorts of their respective legions, and they positioned themselves with only a very small gap to separate them. Because our men were frightened by the unfamiliar tactics of the enemy, they boldly broke through their midst and retreated without casualties. On that day, the military tribune Quintus Liberius Dirus was killed. The Britons were driven back after more cohorts were sent in support. Throughout this unusual combat, when the fighting took place in sight of all and in front of the camp, it was evident that because of their heavy weaponry, our men were ill-equipped for such an enemy. For they could not pursue when the enemy ran, and dared not abandon their close formation. The cavalry fought at great risk too, because the enemy frequently drove away from the fighting on purpose, so when our horsemen had gone some little distance from the legions, they could jump down from their chariots and fight on foot with an unfair advantage. In fact, their strategy for cavalry battle brought us into equal danger, whether in retreat or pursuit. There was also the fact that they never fought in close formation, but rather in small groups, with large spaces between. They had squadrons posted at intervals, and each group took over from another in turn, so that fresh troops could take the place of those who were tired out. The following day, the enemy took up a position on high ground far from camp. They began to appear in small detachments and attack our cavalry, though less eagerly than the day before. At midday, though, when Caesar had sent 3 legions and all the cavalry with his legate Gaius Trebonius to forage for food, the enemy suddenly swept down upon the foragers from all directions, with such force that they did not stop before coming up with the standards of the legions. Our legionaries attacked fiercely and drove them back. They did not halt the pursuit until the cavalry saw the legions behind them and had the confidence in their support to drive the enemy headlong. They cut down a large number and allowed them no opportunity to rally or make a stand, or jump down from their chariots. Directly after this battle, the enemy reinforcements which had mustered all dispersed. Thereafter, the Britons were never at full strength when they engaged with our forces. Caesar learned of their plans and led his army to the river Thames in the territory of Cassivellaunus. This river can only be crossed at a single spot, on foot, and then with difficulty. When he arrived, he observed the large enemy forces drawn up on the opposite bank, the surface of which was protected by a covering of sharpened stakes. Fixed beneath the water, similar stakes were concealed by the river. On learning these facts from prisoners and deserters, Caesar sent the cavalry on ahead and ordered the legions to follow up at once. The soldiers moved with such speed and vigor that although they had only taken their heads above water, the enemy could not withstand the assault of the legions and cavalry, abandoned the riverbank, and took to their heels. As we explained above, Cassivellaunus had given up all hope of a confrontation and dismissed the greater part of his forces, so that about 4,000 charioteers remained. He kept watch on our marches, withdrawing a short distance from the road and keeping himself hidden in difficult wooded terrain. Wherever he knew we would be marching, he forced men and livestock to leave the fields for the forest. Whenever our cavalry rushed into the fields, ranging too freely in search of plunder and devastation, he sent his charioteers by every path and track out the woods. The clash between them brought our cavalry into great danger. Thus, fear prevented them from ranging more widely. All that remained for Caesar was to forbid anyone straying too far from the column of the legions, and to inflict as much harm upon the enemy, by ravaging the fields and starting fires, as the legionary soldiers could manage despite the exertion of the march. Meanwhile, the Trinobantes, one of the most powerful states in those parts, sent envoys to Caesar and promised to surrender to him and obey his commands. A young man of that people, called Mandubracius, had approached Caesar on the Gallic mainland looking for his support, for his father, who had won the kingship in that state, had been killed by Cassivellaunus, while he himself had fled to escape death. The Trinobantes asked Caesar to defend Mandubracius from harm at Cassivellaunus' hands, and to send him to their state to take command and rule over it. Caesar demanded 40 hostages from them, and corn for his army, and sent Mandubracius to them. They quickly carried out his commands, and sent the required number of hostages and the corn. Thus the Trinobantes were made secure, and protected from any harm at the soldiers' hands. Then the Senimagni, the Segontiaci, the Ancilitas, the Bibrosi, and the Cassi sent embassies and put themselves under Caesar's protection. He learned from them that Cassivellaunus' stronghold, which was protected by woods and marshes, was not far from his present location. He had gathered quite a large number of men and cattle there. The Britons, however, apply the word stronghold to a dense wood which they have fortified with a rampart and a ditch, and where they always assemble to avoid enemy attack. Caesar made his way there with the legions, and found it a place with admirable natural and man-made defenses. Nonetheless, he exerted himself to attack it on two sides. The enemy lingered a short while, but did not withstand the assault of our soldiers, and burst out from another part of the stronghold. Large numbers of cattle were found there, and many of the enemy were caught as they fled, and put to death. While all this was taking place in that area, Cassivellaunus sent messengers to Kent, which, as we explained above, is by the sea. This was a region ruled over by 4 kings, Cingetorix, Carvilius, Taximagalus, and Segavix. He ordered them to muster all their forces, strike at the Roman fleet's camp without warning, and launch an assault. When they reached the camp, however, our men made a sortie. They killed a large number of the enemy, captured their aristocratic leader Lugatorix, and returned without casualties. News of this battle reached Cassivellaunus. He had suffered many defeats, and his lands were ruined. He was particularly disturbed by the defection of allied states, so he finally sent envoys to Caesar through Commius the Atrebatian to surrender. Caesar had decided to winter on the mainland for fear of sudden Gallic uprisings. He realized that not much of the summer remained, and that hostilities could easily drag on, so he demanded hostages and settled the annual tribute which Britain must pay to the Roman people. He ordered Cassivellaunus in strong terms to do no harm to Mandubracius or to the Trinobantes. Once he had received the hostages, Caesar led his army back to the coast, where he found the ships repaired. He had a large number of prisoners, while several of the ships had been destroyed in the storm. So once the ships were launched, he decided to transport the army back in 2 journeys. So it came about that neither this year nor the year before was any ship carrying soldiers lost altogether, despite the large number of vessels and voyages. Of those ships which were sent back empty from mainland Gaul, both the ones from which the soldiers who crossed first had disembarked, and the 60 vessels with which Labienus had built after Caesar sailed, excuse me, very few reached the rendezvous. Almost all the rest were forced back. Caesar waited a while for them, but in vain. To avoid being prevented by the season from making the voyage at all, for the autumnal equinox was near, he was forced to pack up the soldiers in more tightly than usual. Then, when a total calm ensued, he weighed anchor at the start of the second watch, reached land at dawn, and brought the whole fleet safely to its destination. Wow. All right, so that is the second British expedition. Let's talk about it. Because there's a decent amount of stuff that happens here, which is really interesting. I think people think, he just invaded Britain, he conquered it, and he came back, and that was it. But there's a lot of kind of political maneuvering here in Britain, just like in Gaul. There's a British prince of a tribe here. Mandubracius, I think was his name, that Caesar mentioned. And he had fled Britain into Gaul and sought Caesar's help. And he's like, look, Cassivellaunus has killed my father, and I want help, Roman help, to come to power. And other tribes, too, send envoys to Caesar. It's not like the Britons are united under one banner. They war with each other. There's tyranny in Britain, just like there's tyranny in Gaul. Some of them are happy to see the Romans, right? They're happy to get Roman help. And they're happy to kind of use the Romans as the Romans use them, right? It's kind of a give and take here between the two factions, or the multiple factions. The Britons also had an unusual way of fighting, right? So they fought primarily with chariots. And I remember the first time I read this, when I read the Gallic War, I was always kind of surprised because I never associate the chariots or chariot fighting with Gaul or with Britain at all. I never think of chariots as part of that region's fighting. So it's kind of funny to think of chariots in Britain and all the forests, but that's how they fought. And the way they would do it is they would come in, they would do quick strikes in small groups against the legionaries, and then before they could take a counterattack, they would wheel around and run away. And then if the cavalry were chasing them, they would stop the chariots, they would hop out real quick, and then probably use their spears or whatever they had and kill the cavalry who were coming after them, and then get back into their chariots and then go again. So there was never an effective way for the Romans to engage this kind of warfare based on how the Romans themselves fought. And the only point at which the Romans could secure a decisive victory was actually when a large force of Britons were attacking foragers, and it sounds like they just overcommitted. They did an all-in strat, and they overcommitted, and then the Romans and the Gallic cavalry who was supporting them was able to come in and basically wipe them out. And that's how the Romans were able to achieve victory against that kind of unique fighting style that the Britons were practicing. So kind of an interesting method, interesting cultures, interesting politics that's going back and forth between all the peoples of the British tribes. And that means we're back in Gaul. So what's going to happen next? Let's find out. Let me take a quick sip of water here. There's so much reading going on. All right. Caesar says, "The ships were beached, and an assembly of the Gauls was held at Samabriva. Samarobriva. Because of a drought, the corn had grown only sparsely in Gaul that year. So Caesar was compelled to allocate the army's winter quarters according to a plan different to that of the previous years, and to spread the legions across a greater number of states. One legion he allotted to his legate Gaius Fabius, to lead it to the Morini, another to Quintus Cicero, to go to the Nervi, and a third to Lucius Roscius, to Esubian territory. He ordered the fourth under Titus Labienus to winter among the Remi, on the borders of the Treveri. He settled 3 legions among the Belgae, and put his quaestor Marcus Crassus and his legates Lucius Munatius Plancus and Gaius Trebonius in charge of them. One legion, which he had enlisted north of the Po only recently, he sent with 5 cohorts to the land of the Eburones, which lies mainly between the Meuse and the Rhine. They were ruled by Ambiorix and Catavolcus. He ordered his legates Quintus Titurius Sabinus and Lucius Cotta to take command of this force. After allocating the legions in this way, he thought that the shortage of corn would be alleviated. In fact, the winter quarters of all the legions, except the one he had allotted to Lucius Roscus to take a very subdued and peaceful region, were all well within 100 miles of each other. Meanwhile, Caesar decided to wait in Gaul until all the legions were posted and their quarters fortified. One of the Carnutes was an aristocrat whose ancestors had held the kingship among their own people. His name was Tascedius. In all his campaigns, Caesar had enjoyed this man's exceptional support, and so, in return for his courage and goodwill, had earlier restored him to the status of his ancestors. In the 3rd year of Tascedius's reign, at the open instigation of many of his own citizens, his enemies killed him. This event was reported to Caesar. Because the affair involved a large number of people, he was afraid that the killers would force the state to rebel. So he sent Lucius Plancus to hasten from Belgium with his legion to the land of the Carnutes, and to winter there, also to arrest and send him all those men who had been implicated in the murder of Tascedius. In the meantime, he was informed by all the legates and quaestors to whom he had entrusted the legions that they had reached their winter quarters and fortified them. About a fortnight after the arrival in winter quarters, revolt and defection suddenly sprang up in the instigation of Ambiorix and Catavolcus. Although they had presented themselves to Sabinus and Cotta on the borders of their kingdom, and had transported corn to the winter camp, messengers from Indutio Maris of the Treveri spurred them on to rouse their own people. They suddenly attacked the men who were sent to fetch wood, and then pressed on in large numbers to the camp to assault it. Our men quickly seized their weapons and climbed up the rampart, while the Spanish cavalry were dispatched from one direction and emerged the victors after a cavalry battle. The enemy abandoned hope and withdrew their men from the assault. Then, in accordance with their custom, they shouted for someone from our side to proceed but to a parley. They wanted to say something, they claimed, which was to the advantage of all, and by means of which they hoped that these quarrels could be abated. A Roman knight called Gaius Arpenius was sent to parley with them. He was a close friend of Sabinus. With him went Quintus Junius, a certain Spaniard who had previously been used to going to and fro at Caesar's command to Ambiorix. In their presence, Ambiorix spoke the following effect. For all Caesar's marks of favor toward himself, he admitted that he was very much obliged, for it was through Caesar's offices that he had been freed from the habitual payment of tribute to his neighbors, the Aduatuci. Also, Caesar had returned his son and his nephew after the Aduatuci had kept them in their midst in chains of slavery among the hostages which were sent to him. His action, he went on, in assaulting the camp was not undertaken of his own free will and decision, but under compulsion from the state. His rule was of such a kind that the masses had as much power over him as he had over them. His state, furthermore, had gone to war because it was unable to withstand a sudden Gallic conspiracy. He could easily prove this by his very insignificance, for he was not so ignorant of affairs as to feel certain of conquering the Roman people with his own forces. However, Ambiorix went on, the whole of Gaul was in agreement. This was the day appointed for attacking all Caesar's winter camps, so that no one legion could come to the aid of another. One group of Gauls could not easily refuse another, especially when it appeared that a plan for recovering the freedom of all was underway. Since he had now done enough for them in respect to his duty to his country, he had to consider what was due in return for Caesar's favors. Ambiorix warned Sabinus. He pleaded with him for friendship's sake, to look to his own safety and that of his soldiers. A great host of Germans had been hired and had crossed the Rhine. In 2 days it would be upon them. It was for Sabinus and Cotta to decide, said Ambiorix, whether they wished to take the men out of winter quarters before the neighboring peoples were aware, and lead them either to Quintus Cicero or to Labienus, one of whom was about 45 miles away, the other a little more. Finally, Ambiorix made this promise, and confirmed it with an oath. He would give them a safe passage through his land, and by doing this, he claimed, he was acting in the interests of his own state, which would have the burden of wintering them lifted, and doing a favor to Caesar in return for his services. After delivering this speech, Ambiorix departed. Arpinius and Junius reported what they had heard to the legates, who were much disturbed by the sudden turn of events. Even if these were the words of an enemy, they still thought they should not be ignored. They were particularly troubled by the fact that it seemed incredible that an obscure and undistinguished nation like the Eburones dared, on their own initiative, to make war on the Romans. So they brought the matter before a council, where fierce disagreement arose between them. Cotta, together with a number of military tribunes and leading centurions, thought that nothing should be done on the spur of the moment, and that they should not leave their winter quarters without orders from Caesar. They argued that the German forces, however large, could be held off if their winter camp were fortified. As proof of this, there was the fact that they had withstood the enemy's first attack with great bravery, and moreover had inflicted many wounds on them. They were not short of corn supplies. In the meantime, help would come from both the winter camps nearby and from Caesar. Lastly, what could be more foolish or shameful than to take advice on a matter of such importance at an enemy's prompting? Sabinus replied by protesting loudly that by the time the enemy hordes, their numbers swelled by German allies, had arrived, or some disaster had occurred in the winter camps nearby, it would be too late to do anything. They had only a short time to decide. He judged that Caesar had left for Italy. Otherwise, the Carnutes would never have adopted a plan of killing Tasgetius, nor, if Caesar were present, would the Eburones display such scorn for our men in approaching the camp. He was not, he said, paying regard to an enemy's prompting, but to the facts of the case. The Rhine was nearby. Germans were smarting at the death of Ariovistus and of our previous victories. Gaul was incensed by the many slights she had endured after being brought under the rule of the Roman people, and by the extinction of her former glory in warfare. Finally, who could be quite sure that Ambiorix had resorted to such a plan except on secure grounds? Either way, his own view was safe. If nothing very untoward occurred, they would reach the nearest legion without risk. If, on the other hand, the whole of Gaul sided with the Germans, their only safety was in flight. What, concluded Sabinus, could be the outcome of the plan proposed by Cotta and the others, disagreeing with himself? Even if the present threat was no reason to be afraid, the hunger inflicted by a long siege certainly would be. Following this argument for both views, Cotta and the centurions vigorously opposed Sabinus, but he raised his voice so that a large number of the soldiers could hear him, and said, "Have it your own way if you must. I am not the man to fear the threat of death, most of all among you. These soldiers will understand. If anything untoward happens, they will demand that you justify yourselves. After all, if only you would let them, the day after tomorrow they would join forces with the nearest camp and endure the hazard of war together with all the rest, instead of being isolated and exiled, to perish from hunger or the sword far from reinforcements." They got up from the council, and their friends seized them both by the hand, pleading with them not to let their own stubborn disagreement jeopardize the outcome. There was no difficulty whether they stayed or left, provided that everyone was in harmony and agreement. If, on the other hand, this dispute continued, they could see no hope of safety. Disagreement over this matter continued until midnight. Finally, Cotta was moved to yield. Sabinus's view prevailed. It was announced that they would set out at dawn. The rest of the night passed in wakefulness, for each soldier looked over his belongings to see what he could take with him and what items of winter kit he must leave behind. All kinds of reasons were thought up as to why it would be unsafe to remain, and how the men's fatigue and constant watches would intensify the risk. At dawn, they set out from the camp, convinced that the advice they had received came not from an enemy, but from a true friend, Ambiorix. The column was a very long one, and its baggage extremely heavy. After the enemy realized, because of all the bustle and watchfulness, that the Romans were on their way, they set up ambushes at two locations in the woods, and then began to await the Romans' arrival in a convenient hidden spot about 2 miles off. When the greater part of the column had descended into a deep ravine, they suddenly appeared at both ends of it and began to attack the rearguard and stop the vanguard from climbing up, engaging with our men in a very unequal position. Because he had anticipated nothing of the kind, it was only then that Sabinus finally showed some anxiety, and ran about arranging his cohorts. Even this he did fearfully, as if all presence of mind were seen to fail him. This generally tends to happen to men who are obliged to make decisions in the midst of action. Cotta, on the other hand, had considered the possibility that this might happen during their march, and for that reason he had not supported the proposal to leave camp. He began to do everything he could to secure the safety of all, and to perform the duties both of a commander, by calling on his men by name and encouraging them, and of an ordinary soldier, by taking part in the fighting. Because the column was so long, it was rather difficult for the commanders to keep watch over everything, and to anticipate what was needed at each point. So they gave orders to pass the word on to abandon the baggage and form a circle. This strategy, though not actually blameworthy in such difficult circumstances, nevertheless had unfortunate consequences, for it weakened the confidence of our soldiers, and made the enemy more eager for the fight. Clearly, the Romans would not have done this until they were in a state of total desperation and panic. Another consequence, inevitably, was that soldiers everywhere started to abandon their standards, and all hurried to look for their most treasured possessions among the baggage and hold on to them. Shouting and weeping filled the air. The barbarians, on the other hand, did not lack a strategy for reacting to this move. Their leaders gave orders to pass the word all down the line. No one was to leave his post. All the booty was theirs, and whatever the Romans left was set apart for them. In this way, they believed everything would be staked on victory. Both in courage and in fighting numbers, they were a match for us. Though abandoned by their commander and by fortune, our men still knew that in courage lay their only hope of safety. Whenever a cohort made a sally, a large number of the enemy facing it fell. Once Ambiorix had noticed this, he gave orders to pass the word that his men must throw their weapons from a distance, rather than approaching too close. He also told them to give ground wherever the Romans attacked. His own men's armor was light, and their daily training also ensured that they would be safe from harm. When the Romans retreated to their standards, though, they were to pursue them. His men carried out his instructions to the letter. Whenever one of the cohorts left the circle and attacked, the enemy retreated at top speed. Inevitably, their sally left a gap, exposing our men to missiles on their open flank. When they began to move back to the post they had left, our men were surrounded. When they began to move back to the post they had left, our men were surrounded by both the enemy who had given way and by the closest of those who had remained in position. If they tried to remain in the circle formation instead, their bravery had no scope for action, while at the same time it was impossible for in such close formation to avoid missiles thrown from the massive enemy host. Encumbered as they were, our men still put up a resistance. Receiving many wounds, the day was more than half over, and they had fought from dawn until the 8th hour, without doing anything to disgrace themselves. Then Titus Balventius, a brave man and strong leader, who had been a senior centurion the year before, had both his thighs pierced by a javelin, and another senior centurion, Quintus Lucanius, went to the assistance of his son, who was surrounded and died fighting courageously. The legate, Lucius Cotta, whilst urging on all the cohorts and the ranks, was wounded by a stone from a sling which hit him full in the face. All this threw Sabinus into a panic. He saw Ambiorix from a distance urging on his men, and sent Gnaeus Pompeius to ask him to spare himself and the Roman soldiers. Ambiorix responded to this appeal by saying that Sabinus was free to parley if he wished. He was hopeful of being able to persuade his force to agree to the Roman soldiers' safety. He promised that no harm should be done to Sabinus and himself, and pledged his own word to that effect. Sabinus reported all this to the wounded Cotta, to get his agreement to the two of them leaving the battle and holding a parley with Ambiorix. He hoped his request to Ambiorix for safety for themselves and their men would be successful. Cotta said that he would not approach an armed enemy, and persisted in this opinion. Then Sabinus ordered the military tribunes presently at his side and the senior centurions to follow him. When he approached Ambiorix, he was told to throw down his weapons. He did what he was told, ordered his men to do the same. In the meantime, while they negotiated terms, Ambiorix deliberately dragged out their discussion. Sabinus was gradually surrounded and killed. Then, indeed, they proclaimed the victory in their accustomed ways, raising a yell of triumph, and made an attack on our ranks, and scattered them. There Lucius Cotta fell fighting, together with most of our soldiers. The rest retreated to the camp they had left behind. Among them was a standard-bearer called Lucius Pastrodius. Hard-pressed by a great host of the enemy, he drew his eagle within the rampart and was cut down as he fought bravely before the camp. They barely managed to keep up the fight until nightfall, and when it was dark, they abandoned hope of saving themselves, and every single one of them committed suicide. A few men who had slipped away from the battle made their way by a haphazard route through the forest to the legate Titus Labienus and his winter quarters. They informed him of all that had occurred. And so we have the greatest betrayal of a Gaul, the so-called King Ambiorix, who actually enjoyed a position of power and not celebrity, but favor due to Caesar. Caesar actually did return Ambiorix' son to him, who was given as a hostage to another tribe, not just the Romans. To a tribe called the Aduatuci, who we read about in the second year. I believe it was in the Belgae conspiracy. They were the tribe who broke their peace. They had made a false peace to the Romans and then broke it that night and tried to attack out of their city, but failed. Ambiorix, let's just review what happened here. Ambiorix ordered his men to attack the Roman camp, attack their foragers, and then in the midst of fighting, a shout was made for a parley. And so there was a temporary truce. Hostilities stopped. And so the Romans sent 2 knights out to talk to Ambiorix, and Ambiorix tells them that a huge host of Germans are crossing the Rhine, that all of Gaul has conspired to kill the Romans, and each one is attacking a separate Roman camp, and there will be no help from any camp to come to each other's aid. Ambiorix says the only reason he did what he did is because he was under an oath to do so. But he did not believe that victory could be won against the Roman people, and he also owed Caesar for his present condition as top of the Eburones. So he said, in attacking you, I fulfilled my obligation to the other Gauls. However, now that I've done that, I need to fulfill an obligation to Caesar and tell him of what's really going on. And so the 2 knights go back to their camp and they tell the legates Sabinus and Cotta of what has occurred and what Ambiorix has told him. And we have 2 great difference in opinions, right? We have Cotta on one side who says, listen, he just attacked us, he's an enemy, that we have no reason to believe what he's saying. We have a good fortified position, we have a lot of food. No matter what's happening, even if they start surrounding us and attacking us, we can hold it off. We've done it before, we can do it again. But Sabinus kind of harps on the emotional side of the men. He says, no, like, if our brothers in another camp are in trouble, we need to go help them. Like, we're letting them die. If you're not going to go help them off this advice, Ambiorix seems like a good guy, then you are letting other Romans die. You're a coward. And Sabinus, when he's not getting his way, because the centurions are like, no, we're with Cotta, he starts just bellyaching really loud so that all the other soldiers hear what he's saying. And the other soldiers start getting involved. And they're like, no, we should be harmonious. We should help the other Romans. This is a big conspiracy. And so eventually Cotta yields, and Sabinus's plan is put into action. And this really proves Sabinus to be the fool. You never trust a Gaul. You never do it. Treason, outright, has come. And so the legions, the legion and a half, I suppose, under their command, marches south to meet with Titus Labienus. And Ambiorix has already set up an ambush because the legion will be forced to march through a deep ravine, a narrow ravine, so their numbers or their lines are very spread out. And through fighting, not only do they wipe out the legions, but when Sabinus goes to Ambiorix to negotiate, to parley for the surrender, so that he can save as many men's lives as he can, after he throws down his weapons, Ambiorix has him and his senior centurions surrounded and murdered. And nearly every single man of Sabinus and Cottus's legions are killed by treachery of the worst kind. Very few make it out, and they make their way to Labienus. But sadly, this is only the first act in Ambiorix's treachery. So now let's read about the aftermath. Caesar says, Ambiorix was ecstatic at this victory. Straight away, he set out with his cavalry for the land of the Aduatuci, which bordered on his own kingdom. He marched for a day and a night without resting, and ordered the infantry to follow on. Once he had described what happened, the Aduatuci were thoroughly roused. Next day he approached the Nervi and urged them not to let slip a chance to liberate themselves forever and inflict vengeance on the Romans for the wrongs they had suffered at their hands. He explained that 2 legates had been killed, and a large part of the army had perished. It would be no trouble at all to attack the legion wintering under Quintus Cicero and annihilate it. He promised to assist them in the business, and his words easily convinced the Nervi. Accordingly, messengers were dispatched at once to the Citronus, Grudi, Lavaci, Plamoxi, and Gedumni, who were all under Nervian rule. They mustered the greatest forces they could, and rushed without warning to the winter camp of Quintus Cicero, who had not yet received news of Sabinus's death. Inevitably, it befell Quintus Cicero, as it also had Sabinus, that some of his soldiers, who had gone into the woods in search of timber for the defenses, were cut off by the sudden arrival of enemy cavalry. They were surrounded, and a vast host of Eburones, Nervi, Aduatuci, and their allies and dependents began to attack the legion. Our men swiftly ran to arms and climbed up the rampart. They barely got through the day, for the enemy's hopes were all pinned on a swift result, and they were sure that once this victory was won, they would be conquerors forever. Quintus Cicero at once sent a dispatch to Caesar, and promised the bearers a great reward if they got it through. But all the roads were blockaded, and the messengers were intercepted. That night, with astonishing speed, our men constructed towers, a full 120 of them, out of the timber which they had gathered for the defenses. Any defects apparent in the defenses were corrected. Next day, the enemy attacked the camp in much greater numbers, and filled in the ditch. Our men resisted in the same way as the day before. Day after day, the same thing happened. At no time of night was there any break from work. Neither the sick nor the wounded were given a chance to rest. Whatever was needed for the next day's fighting was prepared by night. They made ready large numbers of stakes charred at the point, and many javelins of the type used for fighting on walls. The towers were lined with planks, and battlements and parapets of wickerwork attached. Cicero himself was in poor health, but did not even allow himself rest at night. Eventually, he was compelled to spare his exertions by the pressure and insistence of his soldiers. Now the commanders and leaders of the Nervi, who had any means of addressing themselves to Quintus Cicero or any grounds for claiming friendship with him, declared that they wanted to parley. Once the opportunity was granted, they enumerated the same arguments as Ambiorix had used with Sabinus. Namely, that the whole of Gaul was up in arms, the Germans had crossed the Rhine, and the winter camps of Caesar and his legates were under attack. They also reminded him of Sabinus's death, and pointed to Ambiorix to prove their point. If, said the Nervi, the Romans were hoping to receive support and assistance from comrades already despairing of their own situation, they were much mistaken. Where Quintus Cicero and the Roman people were concerned, however, they were not of a mind to refuse anything except the provision of winter quartering, which they did not wish to become a fixed practice. Even so, they would permit the Romans to depart from their camp unharmed, and go wherever they wanted without fear. Quintus Cicero made only one reply to this speech. It was not the Roman people's custom, he said, to accept terms from an armed enemy. If they were willing to lay down their weapons, he would offer them assistance in sending envoys to Caesar. He was hopeful, in view of Caesar's sense of fairness, that they would obtain what they asked. The Nervi had hoped to entrap him, but were thus rebuffed. They now encircled the camp with a 9-foot rampart and a ditch 15 feet wide. They had learned these techniques both from our practice in previous years and from the instruction given by prisoners from our army whom they kept hidden. But as they had no stock of tools suitable for this purpose, they were obliged to cut turves with their swords and to carry the earth away in their hands and cloaks. From this activity it was possible to reckon the size of their host, for they completed this fortification, which was 3 miles all around, in less than 3 hours. During the days which remained, they began to make ready to construct towers, in proportion to the height of the rampart, siege hooks and shelters, just as the same prisoners had instructed them. On the 7th day of the siege, a stormy wind blew up. The Nervi started using slings to fire balls of heated clay and burning darts on the soldiers' cabins, which were thatched in Gallic fashion. They quickly caught fire, and because the wind was so strong, the blaze spread to every part of the camp. The enemy gave a great shout, as if they were certain of a victory already won, and began to mobilize the towers and shelters, and to use ladders to scale the rampart. Everywhere our soldiers were scorched by the flames and harassed by a cascade of missiles, and they realized that all their baggage and their property was being reduced to ashes. Nevertheless, such was the bravery of our soldiers, and their firm resolution, that not only did none of them abandon the rampart to make his escape, but not one of them even so much as looked back. Instead, they all fought as fiercely and as bravely as they could. This day was by far the hardest for our men, but it still resulted in a very large number of the enemy being wounded or killed, for they had crowded together under the actual rampart, and so the rearward ranks gave those in front no opportunity to withdraw. Indeed, when there was a short lull in the fire, in one place a tower was brought up to touch the rampart. Then the centurions of the 3rd cohort retreated from where they were stationed, and moved back all their men. They began to beckon and call to the enemy to enter if they so wished. Not one of them did dare to make the advance. In fact, stones thrown from all directions brought them tumbling down, and the tower was set on fire. In this legion, there were 2 centurions, both men of great courage, and close to reaching senior rank. Their names were Titus Pullo and Lucius Varenus. There was always a dispute going on between them as to which had precedence over the other, and every year they clashed in fierce rivalry over the most important posts. While the fighting at the defenses was at its height, Pullo shouted, "Why are you hesitating, Varenus? What chance are you waiting for of winning praise for your bravery? This day will decide the contest between us." With these words, he made his way outside the defenses and launched an attack where the enemy ranks were densest. Nor indeed did Varenus remain within the rampart, but followed his rival for fear of what men would think of him. Then Pullo cast his spear against the enemy at close range, and transfixed a Gaul who had run forward from the ranks. He was knocked senseless, so they covered him with their shields, and altogether threw their weapons at Pullo, giving him no opportunity to withdraw. Pullo's shield was pierced, and a dart was stuck in his sword belt. This knocked his sheath and hindered his attempt to draw his sword. While he was in difficulties, the enemy surrounded him. But to the rescue came Varenus, his rival, who helped him out of trouble. Straight away the Gauls turned their attention from Pullo to Varenus, thinking the former had been killed by the dart. With his sword, Varenus fought at close quarters. He killed one man and drove the rest off a short way. But he pressed forward too eagerly, tripped and fell into a hollow. Now he was surrounded, and Pullo came to his aid. They killed several Gauls, and both returned safely within the defenses to great acclaim. Thus, fortune played with them both in their rivalry and struggle, so that despite their enmity, each helped and saved the other, and it was impossible to decide which should be considered the braver of the two. The siege became more grim and relentless day by day, especially because so many of our soldiers were wounded, and the task devolved on to a handful of defenders. As the situation worsened, more and more dispatches and messengers were sent off to Caesar. Some of the messengers were caught and tortured in the sight of our men, and then put to death. Within the camp was a well-born Nervian called Vertico, who had fled to Quintus Cicero for refuge at the start of the siege, and had proved his loyalty to him. He used the hope of freedom and a large reward to persuade one of his slaves to carry a dispatch to Caesar. The slave got the message out attached to a spear, and by mingling freely as a Gaul among Gauls, without rousing suspicion, he made his way to Caesar. Through him, the threat to Quintus Cicero and his legion was discovered. Caesar received the dispatch at about the 11th hour of the day, and at once sent a messenger to the territory of the Bellovaci, to his quaestor Marcus Crassus, whose winter camp was about 23 miles away. He ordered Crassus's legion to set out at midnight and come quickly to him. As soon as the messenger arrived, Crassus set out. Caesar sent a second messenger to his legate Gaius Fabius, telling him to take his legion to the territory of the Atrebatus, through which he knew that he too must march. He wrote to Labienus and told him to bring his legion into Nervian territory, if it was possible without endangering the common good. He thought it best not to wait for the rest of the army, which was some distance away. He mustered about 4,000 cavalry from the winter camps nearby. At about the third hour, outriders came to tell him that Crassus was arriving. On that day he advanced 18 miles. He put Crassus in charge of the Samarabriva, and allocated him a legion, because this was where he was leaving behind the army's baggage, the nation's hostages, state documents, and all the corn which he had transported there to provide food throughout the winter. After a short delay, Fabius and his legions, as ordered, met Caesar on the march. Labienus had received news of the death of Sabinus and the slaughter of his cohorts. Now that all the forces of the Treveri had come upon him, he was afraid that if he set out from his camp, it would look as if he was fleeing, and he would be unable to withstand an enemy attack, especially an enemy he knew to be elated because of its recent success. So he wrote to Caesar, explaining how risky it would be to lead his legion out of winter camp. He gave a full account of what had happened in the land of the Eburones, and described how all the infantry and cavalry forces of the Treveri had taken up a position 3 miles from his own camp. Caesar approved his judgment, despite the fact that his hope of having 3 legions was dashed, and he was now reduced to 2. He nonetheless regarded speed as the only means of securing the safety of all. By forced marches, he reached Nervian territory. There he learned from prisoners what was happening with Quintus Cicero, and how dangerous the situation was. Then he persuaded one of the Gallic cavalry, by means of a large bribe, to convey a letter to Quintus Cicero. The dispatch he sent was written in Greek, so that if it was intercepted, the enemy could not discover our plans. If this Gaul was unable to reach him, Caesar told him to hurl a throwing spear inside the camp defenses, with the letter tied to its strap. In it he wrote that he was on his way with the legions and would soon be there, and urged Quintus Cicero to keep up his former courage. The Gaul did fear a threat, and so cast his spear as ordered. By chance, It stuck in one of our towers, unnoticed by our men for 2 days. On the third, it was finally spotted by one of the soldiers, removed and taken to Quintus Cicero. He scanned it through, then read it aloud to an assembly of the troops. This gave rise to great delight among them all. Then, far off, the smoke of burnings was spied, and this put an end to doubt that the legions were at hand. When the Gauls learned from the scouts what was happening, they abandoned the siege and set out against Caesar with all their forces. This totaled about 60,000 men under arms. When the opportunity offered, Quintus Cicero asked the same Vertico, as we mentioned above, for a Gaul to convey a dispatch to Caesar. He warned this man to make his way carefully and with caution. In this letter, he described in full how the enemy had departed from him and turned their entire force against Caesar. This dispatch reached Caesar at about midnight. He told his men what the situation was and encouraged them for the fight. At dawn the following day, he struck camp and marched for about 4 miles before the enemy army was spotted across a valley with a stream in it. It would be very risky to engage on unfavorable ground with so small a force. Besides, he knew that Quintus Cicero was free of the pressure of the siege, so he could accept with equanimity the need to slacken the speed of this march. He halted and fortified a camp in the most advantageous position possible. The camp was already small in itself, numbering scarcely 7,000 men, and these without baggage. Even so, by making the roadways as narrow as possible, he constricted it further, intending to make the enemy treat it with utter derision. Meanwhile, he sent scouts in all directions and spied out the most convenient route for crossing the valley. That day, there were minor cavalry engagements by the waterside, but both sides held their positions. The Gauls were awaiting larger forces which had not yet arrived, but Caesar hoped to lure the enemy on to his ground by pretending to be afraid, and so to engage on his side of the valley in front of the camp. If he could not achieve this, he hoped that once the routes had been reconnoitered, he could cross the valley and the stream with less risk. At dawn, the enemy approached the camp and engaged in battle with our cavalry. Caesar ordered them to give ground on purpose and retreat to the camp. At the same time, he gave orders for the camp to be fortified with a higher rampart on all sides, and the gate to be barricaded, and for these tasks to be carried out with as much rushing about and pretense of panic as possible. All these factors lured the enemy into bringing their forces over and forming up for battle on disadvantageous ground. Our men had even been withdrawn from the rampart, so they came closer and threw missiles inside the fortifications from all sides. Then they sent heralds all around the camp and told them to announce that any Gaul or Roman who wanted to come over to them before the 3rd hour was free to do so unharmed. But after that time, there would be no opportunity. The gates appeared to be barricaded, though in fact it was with only a single layer of turves, and looked impossible to break down. But so deeply did they despise our men that some began to tear down the rampart with their hands, others to fill in the ditches. Then Caesar made a sortie from all the gates, let loose the cavalry, and routed the enemy so swiftly, not even a single enemy Gaul halted to resist. He killed a large number of them and stripped them all of their arms. He was reluctant to pursue them very far, for there were woods and marshes in the way, and he perceived that there was no opportunity for doing the enemy even trivial harm. That same day, all his forces intact, he arrived at Quintus Cicero's camp, and marveled at the towers, shelters, and fortifications the enemy had built. He called a parade of the legion, and learned that not so much as 1 soldier in 10 was unwounded. All this led him to conclude how great had been their danger, and their courage in dealing with what had happened. He praised both Quintus Cicero and his legion as they deserved. Then, one by one, he addressed the centurions and military tribunes, of whose outstanding bravery he had heard from Quintus Cicero. From prisoners, he learned for certain of the disaster which had befallen Sabinus and Cotta. The next day, he held an assembly and related what had happened, offering comfort and reassurance to the soldiers. He told them to bear this loss, incurred through the rash fault of his legate, with greater equanimity, because amends had been made for the setback both by the assistance of the immortal gods and by their own courage. The enemy was left with no lasting cause for celebration, nor would their own grief be lasting. In the meanwhile, news of Caesar's victory was carried with incredible speed to Labienus by the Remi. Even though he was some 55 miles from Quintus Cicero's winter camp, which Caesar had reached after the 9th hour of the day, before midnight a shout went up at the gates of his camp, which marked the fact of the victory and congratulations of the Remi to Labienus. The same news reached the Treveri, so Indutio Maurus, who had decided to attack Labienus's camp the next day, fled under the cover of darkness and took his forces back to the territory of the Treveri. Caesar sent Fabius and his legion back into winter quarters and decided that with his 3 legions he would himself winter around Samarabriva in 3 camps. Because the disturbances which had arisen in Gaul had been so severe, he decided to remain with his army the whole winter. For once the setback of Sabinus's death became known, almost all the Gallic states began to discuss war, sending messengers and embassies to all areas to find out what plan of action the rest were adopting, and where the war should begin, and holding assemblies by night in lonely places. Hardly a moment passed all through the winter without Caesar dealing with some cause of anxiety, or receiving some news of the plans and rebellion of the Gauls. Included among this was the information brought by his quaestor Lucius Roscius, who commanded the 13th Legion. A large Gallic force from the states known as the Aramorican had assembled in order to launch an attack, and were no more than 7 miles from his winter camp. On receiving news of Caesar's victory, however, they had departed, and in such haste that their departure looked more like flight. And so, what we just read essentially was a true-to-life version of Helm's Deep from Lord of the Rings. Ambiorix comes with a greater alliance of Nervi and Ottawatuki among his own soldiers from the Eburones. He surrounds the camp of Quintus Cicero, and if that name sounds familiar, that is because he is the younger brother of Marcus Cicero, the orator, the senator, the former consul in Rome. And Quintus Cicero, after being attacked and very hard-pressed, he receives an offer from Ambiorix, which is almost word for word the same as was given to Sabinus and Cotta. He's like, hashtag not all Gauls. You guys can, get up and leave. We'll provide you safe passage. And Cicero ain't no fool. He is not a fool. He says, we don't negotiate with armed men. If you want to throw down your weapons first, maybe we can have a conversation. And this pisses the Gauls off. You love to see it. And so the siege continues. And so many terrible things happen during the siege, right? Cicero keeps trying to send out messengers every day. He sends out a new messenger on horseback and says, you need to get to Caesar. You need to tell him what's going on. We're under attack. And each day, the messenger on his horse is captured by the Gauls, brought in front of the camp, of the Romans' camp, and tortured in front of all of them to see, so they can hear his screams, and then killed. And this continues on and on. Until finally there is a nervy man, Vertico. Vertico says, I have a slave, and I will make him a promise. I will reward you with your freedom, and a great reward. You need to mingle with the Gauls who are attacking us, and I'm going to give you a letter to Caesar. And once you've mingled with them, you need to slip by and get to Caesar. And he does it. What a madman. He comes through. He gets by the Gauls who attack him. He pretends to be one of them. He's mingling through. He gets by, and he rides hard to Caesar. And Caesar gets the message. And Caesar sends a Gallic auxiliary, a loyal Gaul of his own, to deliver a message back to Cicero. And I can't imagine the stress in everybody's minds that's going on in their hearts. Because this isn't like sending an email. This isn't like sending a text message. No one has a radio to pick up. All their hopes are pinned on one man who is in enemy territory, who is trying to sneak by and deliver a message by throwing a spear into the Roman camp and hoping the Romans notice it's there. When they have literally been under attack for over a week, and there's spears and arrows sticking out everywhere. The Gallic rider that Caesar sends out feels like he can't approach the camp safely, so he ties the message to the spear or the javelin, and he throws it, and it by fortune's chance it lands in the post of one of the towers, but the Romans don't notice it for 2 days. For 2 days, they don't notice it. But finally, one of the men on the ramparts, he's looking around, and he sees this weird javelin, and he's like, "How did that get there?" And he sees the message blowing in the wind off of it, and he takes it down, and he opens it up, and it's in Greek. So he takes it to Quintus Cicero. Quintus Cicero opens the message. And it's a message from Caesar telling the men to stay strong, telling them that Caesar is on his way. And he assembles the men, and in his biggest voice, he reads it in front of all of them, and they let up a cheer. Because that means that one... Remember, they don't know what happened to the slave they sent out. The Gallic slave, did he get it to Caesar? Did he get past the Gauls? Did he get killed along the way? Did he make it to Caesar? Did the Romans kill him by accident because he thought he was a bad guy? They don't know. They have no clue. And now they know that their messenger made it. Not only that, but a messenger from Caesar made it back to them. Interestingly, Caesar... He doesn't try to approach stealthily or anything. He's going through the territory of the Ottawa-Tuki, the hostile Gauls, and he's burning everything he sees. And so from Cicero's camp, eventually they see this huge plume of smoke in the distance. And the Gauls, of course, Ambiorix, his army sees this too. So everyone knows the legions are coming. And because of this, of course, the Gauls under Ambiorix lift the siege. They know Caesar's coming. They say, "Hey, here they come. We're going to fight this out." But Caesar only has 2 legions, and they're not at full strength. He only has 7,000 men. The Gauls have 60,000. Maybe less now because of the fighting. They've lost several. And so he devises a strategy that isn't unlike the strategy that Sabinus himself used before he was killed, obviously, in the years before when the Romans were fighting the maritime tribes. Remember, Sabinus, what he had done is he had pretended to be afraid. He was like, "Oh, I'm not going to give him battle. I'm going to just stay in my camp." And the Gauls were infuriated by this, right? Because they're like, they're afraid. They're hiding in their camp. They're going to try to run. And so the Gauls get increasingly aggressive because they're like, "Okay, we can win this. We can win this." They're demoralized. We can get them. And so they attack, but then Sabinus flipped it on him. He's like, "Aha, we weren't actually afraid. We're going to come at you." And Sabinus won a great victory there. Caesar pulls the same thing. He orders the cavalry to engage, but only for a little bit. And then once they start taking even a little bit of losses, he said, "Okay, run back to the camp. Make it look like you're afraid." He orders the men building up the fortifications to work like they're in a panic. He has the rampart built really high so the Gauls can't see over it. And then he orders the gates barricaded And so it looks like they're just in there and completely afraid. And the Gauls are like, oh man, they've got barely any soldiers. They're afraid. They don't know. They have nothing to do. Quintus Cicero can't help him because all of his men are wounded. He's not going to come out and fight us now. We can get him. And so they make the same mistake. And they surround the camp on all sides. And they're pushing up against the gates. And then Caesar bursts out from all sides and just runs them down. Completely routs this much larger force. And wow. And that is not only this the saving of Cicero's legion, but Labienus, who was under attack by the Treveri, and I think it was Roscius, who was under attack by a different Gallic tribe. Upon hearing of Ambiorix's defeat here, those tribes, they say, you know what, forget it. We're going to give up. And the armies that they have maintained back away. Caesar mentions that there's a lot of conspiracies going on around now. There's a lot of attempted pacts of revolt, and so now he is quite worried about the stability of Gaul. And so we will read about what happens and finish up this chapter of the year 54 and the betrayal of Ambiorix. Let's keep reading. Continuing on, Caesar says, nevertheless, Caesar summoned the leaders of each state to him, by frightening some when he declared that he knew what was going on, and exhorting others, he kept a large part of Gaul loyal. Even so, the Senones, a people who are particularly strong and influential among the Gauls, by popular decision attempted to put one Cavarinus to death. He was the man Caesar had made king among them. At the time of Caesar's arrival in Gaul, his brother Moritascus was king, and his ancestors before him. Cavarinus realized what was happening and fled, so they pursued him right to the border and expelled him from the kingship and his home. Then they sent envoys to Caesar to offer excuses. Although they had ordered their entire senate to come to him, they did not obey him. The barbarian Gauls attached great importance to the fact they had found some people to take the lead in starting a war, and this effected a striking change of heart among them all. So except for the Aedui and the Remi, whom Caesar always held in particular esteem, the former for their long-standing loyalty to the Roman people, the latter for services recently rendered in the Gallic War, there was scarcely a state which did not fall under our suspicion. I do not know that this is such a cause for surprise, for a number of reasons, but especially because the Gauls were once preeminent among all nations for their excellence in war, and hence were deeply mortified at having so ruined this reputation as to bow to the dictates of the Roman people. Thus, Indutio Maris and the Treveri spent the entire winter sending envoys over the Rhine, approaching states for support, pledging money, and claiming that most of our army had been wiped out, and only a much smaller section of it remained. Even so, they failed to persuade a single German state to cross the Rhine, for the Germans declared that they had tried crossing twice before, in the War of Ariovistus and the migration of the Tencteri. They were not about to try their luck another time. Disappointed of his hope, Indutio Maris still began to muster forces, train them, obtain horses from neighboring peoples, and with large bribes to lure outcasts and criminals from all over Gaul to support him. By these means he had acquired such influence in Gaul that embassies flocked to him from all directions, and individuals of governments both sought his favor and his friendship. Then he realized that people were approaching him of their own accord. In one direction were the Senones and the Carnutes, driven by their sense of guilt. In another, the Nervi and the Ottawa-Tuci, preparing for war with the Romans. He would not, therefore, lack a willing army if he began the march from his own borders. So he called an assembly under arms. This is the habitual method of initiating hostilities among the Gauls. By a communal law, all the men of fighting age are accustomed to muster under arms, and the man who is last to arrive is first tortured as the army looks on, and then put to death. At this assembly, Indutio Maris declared Cingetorix an enemy, and had confiscated his property. Cingetorix was his son-in-law, and the leader of the other party, as we showed above. He was a supporter of Caesar, who did not waver in his loyalty. This business was now settled. At the meeting, Indutio Maris declared that he had been summoned by the Senones and the Carnutes and several other Gallic states, and that he would march there through the territory of the Remi, ravaging their lands. Before this, however, he would attack Labienus's camp. He issued instructions as to what he wanted done. Because Labienus was holding his position in the camp, which had strong natural and artificial fortifications, he had no fear of any risk to himself or his legion. And he was considering how to avoid missing any chance of action. So when Cingetorix and his people made known the speech which Indutio Maris had given at the assembly, Labienus sent envoys to the neighboring states and called up cavalry from every region. He set a particular day for their muster. Meanwhile, almost every day, Indutio Maris and all his cavalry were roaming close to the camp. Some of these occasions were for reconnaissance of the camp's position, others for parleys or to induce fear. The cavalry were throwing missiles inside the rampart at frequent intervals. Labienus kept his men within the fortifications and reinforced the impression of cowardice by every possible means. Indutio Maris continued to approach the camp, and his contempt increased day by day. Within the course of a single night, however, Labienus brought inside the walls the cavalry of all the neighboring states, which he had summoned, and so careful was he to keep all his own men within the camp by means of watches that there was no way for the fact of their arrival to be made known or reported to the Treveri. Meanwhile, as was his daily habit, Indutio Maris approached the camp, where he spent most of the day. His cavalry threw missiles and shouted insults to call our men out to fight. Our men gave no reply, and when the enemy felt so inclined, as dusk drew on, they broke up and departed in different directions. Suddenly, Labienus sent all his cavalry out from 2 of the camp gates. He instructed and warned them that once the enemy panicked and fled, he foresaw what would happen, as it indeed did. They should all search only for Indutio Maris. No one was to wound anyone until he had seen that man killed, for Labienus did not want a respite caused by their pursuit of the others to allow him to escape. He promised substantial rewards to those who killed him, and sent cohorts to the cavalry's assistance. Fortune approved Labienus' strategy. When they all made for him alone, Indutio Maris was caught in the shallows of the river and slain. His head was brought back to camp. As they rode back, the cavalry pursued all the Gauls they could, and killed them. When this event became known, all the forces of the Eburones and Nervi, which had mustered, dispersed. Soon afterwards, Caesar ruled over relative calm in Gaul. And so ends the year 54 BC. The treason of Ambiorix and the Eburones has inflicted a devastating defeat on the Roman legions. But just as quickly as their fortunes seemed to be fading, Caesar arrives and reverses a bad situation and turns it into a winning one. Now I want to talk a little bit about this chapter because I think this is the most significant event in the war. Up to this point, right, there's a lot of negotiation. There's a lot of back and forth of deals, the surrenderings of hostages, the relationships growing and ebbing and kind of ebbing and fading between the tribes and the Romans, and then the tribes and the other tribes. Caesar, of course, mentions two of them by name. The Aedui, of course, that was from Dumnorix and Divicius, and the Remi, as maintaining their loyalty to the Roman people this whole time and not breaking their word. And the Remi, of course, especially the Remi, because of their position, the Remi, again, are in Belga, the territory of the Belgae, of Belgica, right? And the Belgae is where, like, the Eburones are. That's where the Nervi are. That's where all this stuff is happening. That's where the Treveri are. And so they're in the most precarious position. But because Caesar has now, made a pact with them, he's also responsible for delivering on their defense if they're in need. So when this war started, who was Caesar working on behalf of? Well, it was really the Aedui and the Allobroges, the Vacanti. It was the southern tribes that are near the borders of Rome. Well, not the city of Rome, but Roman territory. So Transalpine Gaul, Cisalpine Gaul. So he's engaging in fights not only for Rome's behalf. Obviously, Rome wants a secure border and wants to not have the threat of Germans coming down or different hordes coming down, but also because there's mandates. Of course, Rome has mandates like, hey, we've got allies here, and if you're able to protect these allies from harm, you ought to do so. That's your job. Your job as proconsul. You're not just a governor. You're not just a governor like of a state of California, right? If the state of California, that's probably a bad example, but let's say Alaska, right? Alaska borders Canada. And let's say there's, Canadians are under attack for some reason from random Russian tribes that are coming over. The governor of Alaska isn't just responsible for the American people in Alaska. They're also responsible they have their own army. They're responsible for protecting the Canadians from the Russians. It's not the president of the United States who's just doing that. It's the governor. The governor has an active responsibility. He has imperium, right? He has the authority to act with the voice of Rome by itself, essentially. That's what it means to have imperium. And then the war goes on, right? And now we've gone into the fifth year, say 58, 55, sorry, 50, 58, 57, 56, 55, 54, the fifth year. And Caesar is in a predicament, right? Because he's brought in more troops. And he's finding himself fighting wars further and further from his own territory. Like, he's not close to Cisalpine or Transalpine Gaul. He's not close to his province. He marches across the Rhine. And the Rhine isn't close to Transalpine Gaul. He goes over to Britain, and Britain sure as heck isn't close to Transalpine or Cisalpine Gaul. So when he has to winter his legions, he has to do it in Gaul. And he mentioned this, he's like, because of the size of the force I now command and the needs of the men, right? Like, these forces aren't just self-sufficient. They need food. The cattle, the horses they have need fodder. They need water. There's many needs that these armies have. Their needs, they have to have a supply chain of some sort. And Caesar said, we can't just put all of them in one place because they would drain the resources of whatever tribe we put them with. So his solution is to send one legion each to a different tribe in a different area of Gaul to lessen the burden on the people, on both his own army and then on the people he's staying with. Obviously, he sends the most to the Belgae because that's the kind of the most dangerous frontier of the war. Also, the Remi are there, so it makes sense that he has men close to that area because he has an ally in that area. But as we see, the Gauls and Ambiorix is able to take advantage of this position Caesar has made for himself by feeding them misinformation, right? He tells them everybody's under attack, there's a conspiracy, and he gets Sabinus especially to believe his words and really takes advantage. And it really shows that even though Ambiorix does lose, it shows that the position that Gaul is in is very precarious. This isn't just, Caesar acting on behalf of a state or on behalf of, a mandate or anything. Now it's almost a quagmire. Well, if we leave, like let's say the Romans just turn around, I disband the armies, okay, we're going back. The Remi are dead. The Remi are gone if he does that. The Aedui, they're going to be reduced real fast. Yeah, so I think there's a situation here that's grown beyond perhaps the initial purview of what he may have thought. But we'll leave that for another day. And speaking of the other day, let's talk about what's coming next. So we just finished the 6th book, and that was the year 700 AUC by the Roman calendar. So AUC is the Roman year. And we are entering into the year 701. In the year 53. And this is one of my favorite books, even though there's a lot of like kind of non-war things that happen in it, and I'll tell you why. So the consuls of the year are Gnaeus Domitius Calvinus, and Marcus Valerius Messala. And the title of this chapter is The Second Crossing of the Rhine, the Ethnology of Gaul and Germany, the Search for Ambiorix, and the Invasion of the Sigumbri. And you might have heard a couple things. You're like, wait a minute, the ethnology of Gaul and Germany. Yeah, this is going to be Caesar writing not just about, the battles or the strategies or anything. It's going to be about Gaul and Germany. Not just the nations, but the people, their customs, their religions, the wildlife, the terrain, the flora, the fauna, the culture of the people that he's been interacting with for years and years now. And so it's going to be interesting because it's going to give us a very clear picture of societies in the 1st century BC and who the Romans are having to interact with. Of the Romans we know so much because they were an advanced civilization. They wrote things down. They created histories, so we understand a lot from them. They created art. They created great structures, monuments. Much of Rome survives. But not much of Gaul survives. Nothing of real, not nothing, but very little comparatively survives there. So having these words written down really opens a window for us to see what were things like back then. But we are at our 2-hour mark. We made it through it. That was a big old juicy chapter. So thank you everyone for joining me for this today. I really appreciate it. If you're watching this on YouTube and you made it all the way to the end, then congratulations. I hope it was exciting. Thank you so much for joining me on Twitch. As you know, we are streaming this on Twitch, so you can go to twitch.tv/authorvalentine. Of course, you can like and subscribe. That also helps the channel a lot. We'll be doing continuous uploads. We will be back next week, next Wednesday, for Book 6. And after that, well, shoot, we'll be in the year 52, Book 7, which is actually the last book of the Gallic War. Now, spoiler alert, Book 7 is much longer than any of the books we've done so far, so we're going to be dividing that into probably 3 different segments, but that'll come later. For now, we'll be doing all of Book 6 next week. All right, guys, thank you so much for everything. I really appreciate it. Until the next one, have a good rest of your days. Bye-bye.